Think about this for a second. For 124 years, the most powerful economy on Earth operated without a central bank. No Federal Reserve, no lender of last resort, no institution capable of expanding or contracting the money supply in times of crisis. From 1836, when President Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States, all the way to 1913, when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, America was essentially flying blind through the most turbulent century of economic expansion the world had ever seen. During that time, the question of who actually controlled the money was not academic. It was existential. Because in that vacuum, someone always fills the void. Private bankers, railroad magnates, political operatives, and a small circle of financiers whose names you already know. They stepped in and assumed the role that no government institution was willing to play. The country lurched from one devastating financial panic to the next, and each time the dust settled, the same men emerged on the other side, richer, more powerful, and more entrenched than before. The story of how America got its central bank is not just a story about economics. It is a story about power, secrecy, and the invisible architecture that holds a nation together or tears it apart. To understand why America spent over a century without a proper central bank, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the founding of the Republic itself. When two brilliant men with fundamentally opposing visions of what America should be laid the groundwork for a fight that would rage for generations. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, a man who saw the future of the United States as an industrial and commercial powerhouse, a nation that could rival the great empires of Europe on the world stage. Hamilton was deeply impressed by the Bank of England, which had operated as Britain's central bank since 1694, and had, in Hamilton's view, been one of the secret engines behind Britain's rise from a peripheral island nation to a global superpower. The British historian John Brewer once argued that Britain's dominance owed more to its bankers and bureaucrats than to its generals and soldiers. Hamilton agreed wholeheartedly. He believed that a strong centralized financial institution was the sinew that held a modern nation together. Without it, you had chaos, competing currencies, unstable credit, and no way to fund wars, build infrastructure, or repay debts. And the debts were enormous. The Revolutionary War had left the young nation drowning in obligations. The states owed money. The federal government owed money. Soldiers who had fought and bled for independence were holding worthless promissory notes that nobody could honor. Hamilton saw this financial wreckage not just as a crisis, but as an opportunity. If the federal government could assume the debts of the states and establish a national bank to manage them, it would centralize financial power, establish American creditworthiness in international markets, and bind the states to the federal government with chains of mutual interest. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, a man who envisioned a fundamentally different America. Jefferson saw the future of the nation in its farmers and its soil, not in its bankers and its ledgers. He was deeply suspicious of concentrated financial power, viewing it as a threat to individual liberty and a tool that would inevitably be captured by a wealthy elite at the expense of common citizens. Jefferson argued that the Constitution granted the federal government no authority to create a bank, and that doing so would set a dangerous precedent for federal overreach. He saw Hamilton's proposal as a Trojan horse, a mechanism that would enrich speculators and merchants in the commercial Northeast, while saddling farmers and planters in the South and West with the costs. The debate was ferocious. It was personal. And it defined the battle lines of American politics for decades to come. Hamilton and Jefferson were not just arguing about banking policy, they were arguing about the soul of a nation. What kind of country would America become? Would it be governed by institutions designed to project financial and military power, or would it be a loose confederation of independent-minded citizens suspicious of any authority beyond their own communities? In the end, Hamilton won the first round. After the bill cleared Congress with intense debate, President George Washington signed it into law in February of 1791, and the first Bank of the United States opened its doors in Philadelphia in December of that same year. It received a 20-year charter. The bank was capitalized at $10 million, a colossal sum at the time, with the federal government holding a 20% stake and private investors owning the remaining 80%. It had the authority to collect revenues, issue a common currency backed by gold, make loans to the government, and hold federal deposits. It was, in every meaningful sense, a central bank, and by most objective measures, it worked remarkably well. The bank stabilized the currency, facilitated government operations, and helped establish the United States as a credible borrower in international markets. Government bonds that had been trading at steep discounts rose to their full value. Foreign investment began flowing into the young nation. The bank's branches, eventually numbering 8 locations stretching from Boston to New Orleans, created the first truly national financial network in American history. For 2 decades, the country enjoyed relative financial stability. But success did not quiet the opposition. If anything, it sharpened it. Jefferson's allies, the Democratic Republicans, never accepted the bank's legitimacy. They pointed to the fact that a significant number of the bank's shareholders were foreign investors, many of them British subjects, as evidence that the institution served foreign interests rather than American ones. The irony was rich, of course. Just 15 years after fighting a bloody war for independence from Britain, America's most important financial institution was partly owned by British investors. To the Jeffersonians, this was an outrage. By 1811, when the bank's 20-year charter came up for renewal, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Hamilton was dead, killed in a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. His Federalist Party was fading. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans controlled the government. State banks had multiplied across the country, and their owners had no love for a powerful national competitor that could constrain their lending. The charter was allowed to expire by a single vote in the Senate. The first Bank of the United States closed. The timing could not have been worse. The following year, in 1812, the United States went to war with Britain again. Without a national bank to manage war finances, the Treasury was left scrambling. The government tried to fund the war through borrowing, but without a central institution to coordinate the effort, the results were disastrous. State banks issued their own currencies with reckless abandon, many of them backed by little more than optimism. Inflation spiraled. The government's credit deteriorated rapidly. By 1814, the United States Treasury was effectively bankrupt. The chaos was so severe that even James Madison, who had been one of the most vocal opponents of Hamilton's original bank, reversed his position entirely. Madison, now president, concluded that a central bank was not a luxury, but a necessity for a functioning government in a time of crisis. In 1816, he signed into law the Charter for the Second Bank of the United States, granting it a 20-year mandate to restore order to the nation's finances. The Second Bank opened with high ambitions and immediate problems. It was capitalized at $35 million, with the federal government again holding a 20% stake. It was supposed to provide a stable national currency, regulate the lending practices of state banks, and serve as the government's fiscal agent. But in its early years, the bank was plagued by mismanagement and corruption. Its first president, William Jones, was widely considered incompetent. Loans were handed out to political cronies with little regard for creditworthiness. Within 2 years of opening, the bank found itself on the brink of insolvency. Then came the Panic of 1819, the first major peacetime financial crisis in American history. Crop prices collapsed, land speculators were wiped out, banks across the country failed. The second bank, which had been created specifically to prevent this kind of catastrophe, made things worse by aggressively calling in loans and contracting credit in a desperate attempt to save itself. The fallout was devastating, particularly in the South and West, where farmers and small businessmen bore the brunt of the suffering. Public fury toward the bank was immense, and for many Americans it confirmed everything Jefferson had warned about. A centralized financial institution was not a guardian of the public interest. It was a weapon in the hands of the powerful. Under its next president, Nicholas Biddle, who took over in 1820, the second bank gradually regained its footing. Biddle was brilliant, cultured, and deeply knowledgeable about finance. Under his leadership, the bank operated what was arguably the most effective central banking system in the world at that time. He understood that the bank's real power lay in its ability to regulate the currency supply by controlling the flow of gold, silver, and banknotes throughout the economy, by expanding or contracting its lending, and by presenting state bank notes for redemption. Biddle could effectively influence credit conditions across the entire country. It was sophisticated, it was stabilizing, and it made a lot of very powerful people very uncomfortable. Enter Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, a man who despised banks with every fiber of his being. Jackson had nearly been ruined early in his life by a bad land deal and a worthless banknote, and the experience left him with a visceral, almost pathological distrust of the entire banking system. To Jackson, the second bank was not a stabilizing force. It was a monster, a creature of privilege and corruption that concentrated immense economic power in the hands of a tiny elite, while ordinary farmers and laborers suffered. Jackson saw the bank as fundamentally un-American, an institution that was, in his words, unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive to the rights of states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. In 1832, Jackson vetoed the bill to recharter the bank, and in doing so, he issued one of the most famous and consequential veto messages in American history. It was not just a policy document, it was a manifesto. Jackson framed the fight in populist terms, pitting the common man against entrenched financial interests. He accused the bank of wielding its power for the benefit of the wealthy few at the expense of the many. He attacked the foreign ownership of its stock. He questioned its constitutionality, and he dared Congress to override him. They could not. Jackson won re-election in a landslide that year, interpreting his victory as a mandate from the people to destroy the bank once and for all. In 1833, he began pulling federal deposits out of the second bank and placing them in state-chartered banks, institutions his critics mockingly called pet banks, because of their political connections to Jackson's allies. Biddle retaliated by contracting credit sharply, hoping to create enough economic pain to force Congress to override Jackson. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of blaming Jackson, the public blamed Biddle, seeing his actions as proof that the bank was exactly the kind of unaccountable, vindictive institution Jackson had warned about. The Second Bank of the United States died a slow death. Its federal charter expired in 1836. Biddle attempted to keep it alive as a state-chartered institution in Pennsylvania, but it failed completely by 1841. And just like that, America was without a central bank. Again. What followed was one of the most chaotic and volatile periods in American financial history. Without a central authority to regulate the money supply, stabilize the banking system, or act as a lender of last resort during crises, the country entered what historians call the free banking era. And if the name sounds quaint and optimistic, the reality was anything but. Under this system, individual states were free to charter their own banks with minimal oversight. The result was an explosion of new banking institutions, hundreds and then thousands of them, each issuing its own currency. By the 1850s, there were an estimated 7,000 different types of banknotes circulating in the United States. Some were legitimate, backed by adequate reserves. Many were not. These so-called wildcat banks would set up operations in remote locations, literally out where the wildcats roamed, issue mountains of paper currency backed by little or nothing, and then vanish when their customers came to redeem their notes for gold or silver. The situation was a counterfeiter's paradise and a merchant's nightmare. Every transaction required evaluating whether a particular banknote was legitimate, whether the bank that issued it was still solvent, and what discount to apply based on the bank's distance and reputation. Guidebooks were published listing thousands of banks and their notes, rating each one's reliability. The simple act of buying goods became an exercise in forensic accounting. And then there were the panics. Without a central bank to cushion the shocks, the American economy was brutally exposed to the boom and bust cycles that plagued 19th century. Between 1863 and 1910 alone, there were 3 major banking panics and at least 8 more localized financial crises. Each one followed a depressingly familiar pattern. A period of speculative excess would inflate asset prices beyond any sustainable level. Then, some triggering event, a bank failure, a crop failure, a geopolitical shock, would send a tremor through the system. Depositors, terrified of losing their savings, would rush to pull their money out. But because banks operated on fractional reserves, lending out most of the money deposited with them, no bank could survive a mass withdrawal. Even healthy, well-managed banks would collapse under the weight of a full-blown run. And because there was no lender of last resort, no institution that could inject liquidity into the system when everyone else was hoarding cash, each panic had the potential to cascade into a full-scale depression. The Civil War brought a partial response to this disorder. In 1863 and 1864, Congress passed the National Banking Acts, which created a system of nationally chartered banks subject to federal regulation. These national banks could issue a standardized currency, national banknotes, backed by United States government bonds. The acts also imposed a punitive 10% tax on state banknotes, effectively driving them out of circulation and creating, for the first time, something approaching a uniform national currency. But the National Banking Acts did not create a central bank. They established no mechanism for managing the money supply, no lender of last resort, no elastic currency that could expand or contract in response to economic conditions. The volume of national banknotes was tied to the supply of government bonds, not to the actual needs of the economy. When businesses needed credit most, during harvest season, during periods of rapid growth, the currency supply was often at its most rigid. The system was, in the words of the Federal Reserve's own historians, a recipe for crisis. And crisis is exactly what they got. The Panic of 1873 was savage. It was triggered by the collapse of J. Cook and Company, one of the most prominent investment banks in the country, which had overextended itself financing railroad construction. The New York Stock Exchange was forced to close for 10 days, the first time in its history. The depression that followed lasted 6 years and was at that time the worst the United States had ever experienced. Banks failed by the hundreds. Unemployment soared. The misery was widespread and deep. The Panic of 1893 was even worse. It coincided with the deepest depression the country had yet known. Over 500 banks closed their doors. Unemployment reached somewhere between 17 and 19%. Entire communities were devastated. And the most remarkable thing about this particular crisis was how it ended. It was not resolved by government action. It was not resolved by legislation. It was resolved by one man, a private citizen named John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan was, by the 1890s, the most powerful banker in America, possibly the most powerful private financier in the world. He controlled an empire that stretched across railroads, steel, electricity, and banking. When the Panic of 1893 threatened to bring down the entire financial system, it was Morgan who stepped in, organizing a syndicate of bankers to provide emergency gold reserves to the United States Treasury. The federal government was so depleted that it quite literally needed a private citizen to bail it out. The implications were staggering. The richest country on earth, the engine of the world's industrial revolution, had no institutional capacity to manage its own financial crises. It depended on the goodwill and the of a single elderly banker to prevent economic collapse, and Morgan knew it. He used his leverage to extract favorable terms from the government and to consolidate his own power over the banking system. It was a rescue and a power play rolled into one. Then came 1907, and the pattern repeated itself with even greater urgency. The panic of 1907 was triggered by a failed attempt to corner the copper market, but its causes ran much deeper. The banking system was fragile, undercapitalized, and riddled with interconnections that amplified shocks rather than absorbing them. Trust companies, which operated like banks but with fewer regulations and thinner reserves, were particularly vulnerable. When depositors began pulling their money out of the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York, the panic spread like wildfire. Once again, it was Morgan who stepped into the breach. At 70 years old and in declining health, Morgan summoned the leading bankers of New York to his private library on Madison Avenue and essentially locked them inside until they agreed to pool their resources and stop the hemorrhaging. He personally examined the books of troubled institutions, deciding which ones were worth saving and which ones should be allowed to fail. He strong-armed reluctant bankers into contributing to rescue pools. He even persuaded the clergy of New York to deliver calming sermons from their pulpits on Sunday morning to prevent a fresh wave of panic on Monday. Morgan succeeded in stopping the immediate crisis. But the cost was enormous, and the aftermath raised questions that could no longer be ignored. The Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation launched in 1912, examined this concentration of financial power in the United States and produced findings that shocked the nation. The committee concluded that a small cartel of financiers, led by Morgan and a handful of other New York bankers, had gained consolidated control over vast swaths of American industry. The committee's report found that the officers of J.P. Morgan and Company sat on the boards of directors of 112 corporations with a combined market capitalization of $22.5 billion. For context, the total capitalization of the entire New York Stock Exchange at that time was estimated at roughly $26.5 billion. Morgan and his associates effectively controlled 85% of the market. The conclusion was inescapable. In the absence of a central bank, a private money trust had filled the vacuum. A handful of men, accountable to no one, had assumed the powers and prerogatives of a central banking system. They decided who received credit and who did not. They determined which industries thrived and which ones withered. They had the power to trigger panics and the power to end them, and they used both. The irony was almost unbearable. Andrew Jackson had killed the Second Bank of the United States because he believed it concentrated too much financial power in too few hands. 80 years later, the absence of a central bank had produced exactly the outcome Jackson had feared, only worse. Instead of a regulated institution with at least some degree of public accountability, the money supply was controlled by unregulated private bankers who operated in near total secrecy and answered to no democratic authority whatsoever. This was the landscape into which a German-born banker named Paul Moritz Warburg stepped with an idea that would change America forever. Warburg was born in 1868 into an aristocratic Jewish banking family in Hamburg, Germany. The Warburg family had been in banking and commerce for nearly 3 centuries. Paul was educated at some of Europe's finest financial institutions, completing his training at banking houses in London and Paris before embarking on a world tour to study international finance. In 1895, he married Nina Loeb, the daughter of Solomon Loeb, one of the founding partners of the powerful Wall Street investment bank Kuhn, Loeb and Company. By 1902, Warburg had accepted a partnership at the firm and established permanent residence in New York. What Warburg found when he arrived in America appalled him. Coming from the European banking tradition, where central banks like the Reichsbank in Germany and the Bank of England in Britain provided stability, elasticity, and a coordinated response to financial disturbances. The American system looked primitive and dangerously fragile. There was no centralized reserve system. There was no mechanism to provide emergency liquidity during crises. The currency was inelastic, meaning its supply could not expand or contract in response to the actual needs of the economy. Banks hoarded reserves in good times and ran out of them in bad times. The entire system, in Warburg's view, was an accident waiting to happen, and the panic of 1907 proved him right. Warburg began a one-man crusade to reform the American banking system. He wrote articles, gave speeches, published pamphlets, and buttonholed every influential figure he could find. His central argument was simple but radical for the American context. The United States needed what every other major industrial nation already had: a central bank that could coordinate reserves, issue an elastic currency, and serve as a lender of last resort in times of crisis. He studied the European models exhaustively and adapted their principles for the American political environment, recognizing that any proposal that smelled of a single all-powerful central bank would be dead on arrival in a country still haunted by the ghost of Andrew Jackson. Warburg's ideas found a receptive audience in certain quarters, particularly among the financial elite who had lived through the panics and understood the fragility of the existing system. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which provided for the issuance of emergency currency during crises and, more importantly, established the National Monetary Commission to study the banking systems of other countries and recommend a long-term solution for the United States. The commission was chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, one of the most powerful Republicans in Washington and, not coincidentally, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Aldrich spent 2 years touring Europe, studying central banks in England, France, and Germany. By the fall of 1910, he was convinced that the United States needed its own central banking institution. But he also understood that designing such an institution in the open, through the normal legislative process, would be politically impossible. The populist anger against Wall Street was too intense. The memory of the money trust was too fresh. Any bill associated with big banks would be attacked as a tool of the financial elite. And so, Aldrich made a decision that would become one of the most famous episodes in American financial history. In November of 1910, he organized a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia that was owned by some of the wealthiest men in America. The Islands Club had been founded in 1886, and its membership roster read like a who's who of American plutocracy: J.P. Morgan, William Kissam Vanderbilt, Marshall Field. A magazine had once described it as the richest, the most exclusive, and the most inaccessible club in the world. Aldrich invited 6 men to join him, each chosen for his banking expertise and his connections to the most powerful financial institutions in the country. The group included Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Company, Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York and closely associated with the Rockefeller interests, Paul Warburg, the Kuhn-Loeb partner who had been the intellectual driving force behind banking reform. A. Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Charles D. Norton, president of Morgan's First National Bank of New York, and Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's personal secretary. The secrecy was elaborate and deliberately theatrical. Aldrich instructed her to come one at a time to a train terminal in New Jersey, where they would board his private rail car under the pretense of a duck hunting trip. Once aboard, the men were forbidden from using their last names. They addressed each other only by first names: Nelson, Harry, Frank, Paul, Piatt, and Arthur, to prevent the staff from identifying them. One participant even brought a borrowed shotgun to maintain the cover story, although none of them had any intention of hunting ducks. For decades afterward, the group referred to themselves as the First Name Club. For roughly 10 days on Jekyll Island, these men hammered out the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. Warburg was the intellectual engine of the group, but there was a key tactical disagreement. Aldrich wanted a straightforward central bank on the European model, a single powerful institution run by Warburg, backed by the other participants, argued that political realities made this impossible. Any plan had to be disguised, wrapped in the camouflage of decentralization. The compromise they reached was elegant and deliberately misleading. Instead of one central bank, they proposed a network of regional reserve banks scattered across the country, giving the appearance of distributed power while maintaining centralized coordination underneath. The plan that emerged from Jekyll Island was presented to the public as the Aldrich Plan and introduced into Congress. But it was immediately attacked from all sides. Progressives denounced it as a creature of Wall Street. The populist firebrand William Jennings Bryan assailed it as a tool of the hated New York money trust. Democrats, who won control of Congress in the 1910 elections and the White House in 1912 with Woodrow Wilson, refused to pass anything with Aldrich's name on it. But here is the remarkable thing. The bill that eventually passed, the Federal Reserve Act, was structurally almost identical to the plan conceived at Jekyll Island. The names were changed. The political packaging was different. Virginia Representative Carter Glass and Senator Robert Owen shepherded the new version through Congress, and it was framed as a democratic reform rather than a Wall Street initiative. Wilson insisted on a Federal Reserve Board appointed by the president to maintain at least the appearance of government oversight. But, as Frank Vanderlip, one of the Jekyll Island attendees, later admitted in his autobiography, although the Aldrich Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that was finally adopted. The legislative battle was ferocious. Progressive Democrats demanded a system fully owned and controlled by the government in order to destroy the concentration of credit in Wall Street. Conservative Democrats wanted a decentralized system controlled privately, but free from New York's domination. Republicans wanted something closer to the original Aldrich proposal. Nobody got exactly what they wanted, which is perhaps why the compromise ultimately worked. The bankers, who had helped design the system, grumbled that it gave the government too much control. Populists in Congress warned that it did not go far enough in breaking the money trust. Republican Congressman Victor Murdoch of Kansas, who voted for the bill, told his colleagues on the floor of the House that the concentrated control of credit had not been defeated. The money trust, he said, had not passed. On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. On the occasion, his Secretary of Agriculture, David Houston, wrote in his diary that the impossible had happened. It was passed by a Congress dominated by Democrats, 2/3 of whom had been unsound on currency questions, and a majority of whom could scarcely be said to have understood what the measure meant and what it accomplished. Houston was being blunt, but he was not wrong. The Federal Reserve Act was one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history, and yet the majority of the people who voted for it barely understood what they were creating. The 12 regional Federal Reserve Banks began operating in November of 1914, just as World War I was erupting across Europe. The system's first real test came almost immediately, and it would be shaped and reshaped by wars, depressions, and political struggles for the next century. But stepping back from the legislative details, there's a deeper story here, one that connects the founding of the Federal Reserve to the broader themes of power, capital, and control that have defined American history from the beginning. The fight over who controls the money is never really about the money itself. It is about who wields the power that money represents. Hamilton understood this. Jefferson understood this. Jackson understood this. Morgan understood this. and the men who gathered on Jekyll Island understood it perhaps better than anyone. Consider the patterns. Every time America tried to establish a central bank, it was eventually destroyed by populist opposition that saw a centralized financial power as incompatible with democratic governance. And every time the central bank was destroyed, the resulting chaos created conditions that concentrated even more financial power in fewer hands than the central bank itself ever had. Jackson killed the second bank to prevent the concentration of financial power. And the result was a free banking era so unstable that it produced the very conditions that allowed J.P. Morgan and a handful of Wall Street bankers to become more powerful than any bank president had ever been. The cure turned out to be worse than the disease. The Federal Reserve was supposed to be the final answer, the permanent solution that balanced the competing demands of centralized stability and democratic accountability. And in many ways, it succeeded. The panics that had plagued the 19th century, those terrifying episodes of bank runs, currency collapses, and economic free falls, became far less frequent after the Fed's creation. The elastic currency that Warburg championed allowed the money supply to expand during times of economic stress and contract during periods of overheating. The lender of last resort function gave banks a safety net that prevented localized failures from cascading into systemic collapse. But the Federal Reserve also carried the DNA of its origins in ways that continue to shape its operations and its critics' objections to this day. It was designed by bankers for a banking system. Its regional structure was a political compromise, not an optimal institutional design. The tension between its public mission and its private ownership by member banks has never been fully resolved. And the secrecy that characterized its birth on Jekyll Island has cast a long shadow over its legitimacy in the eyes of many Americans who remain deeply suspicious of concentrated financial power. The creation of the Federal Reserve also did not eliminate the fundamental problem that had plagued American finance since Hamilton and Jefferson first clashed in Washington's cabinet. It merely transformed it. Instead of asking who controls the money when there is no central bank, the question became who controls the central bank. And that question, it turns out, is just as contentious, just as politically explosive, and just as difficult to answer definitively. Within its first decade of operation, the Federal Reserve slashed average bank reserve requirements from 21.1% to 11.6%, a reduction of 45%. By 1917, just 3 years later, those requirements were cut again to an average of 9.8%. The money supply doubled between the Fed's inception in 1914 and 1919. Some economists would later argue that these early policies contributed directly to the speculative excess of the 1920s and ultimately to the catastrophic deflation of the Great Depression, the very kind of systemic crisis the Fed had been created to prevent. The story is not neat. It does not have a clean moral or a satisfying resolution. The men who built the Federal Reserve were not heroes, and they were not villains. They were pragmatists operating within a deeply flawed system, trying to solve a real problem while also protecting their own interests. Hamilton was right that a nation without a central bank was vulnerable to chaos. Jefferson was right that a central bank could become a tool of elite power. Jackson was right that concentrated financial institutions could corrupt the democratic process. And Morgan was right that in the absence of institutional safeguards, private power would always expand to fill the void. What the history of American finance before 1913 reveals more than anything else is that the question of who controls the money is never truly settled. It is renegotiated in every generation through crises and compromises, through legislation and backroom deals, through populist uprisings and elite maneuvering. The Federal Reserve did not end the struggle. It simply gave it a new arena. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this. The men who designed the Federal Reserve understood something that the public largely did not. They understood that the system of money and credit is not a natural phenomenon like gravity or weather. It is a constructed thing, a human artifact designed by specific people to serve specific purposes. And whoever designs the system sets the rules. Whoever sets the rules determines who wins and who loses. And whoever determines who wins and who loses holds a form of power that transcends elections, legislation, and even constitutions. That is why, more than a century after the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law, the debate over central banking remains so charged, so personal, so resistant to resolution. It is not really a debate about interest rates or reserve requirements or monetary policy. It is a debate about power itself, about who gets to decide the fundamental rules of the economic game that every citizen is forced to play. And the answer to that question, as the history before 1913 makes painfully clear, is never as democratic as we like to believe. If you found this story revealing, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really does help the channel grow, and it means we can keep digging into the stories behind the systems that shape our world. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and if you want to go even deeper, check out the video on screen right now. I think you will find it just as eye-opening. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.